I wanted to tell you the name of the talk today is The Implications of Sounding Like a Stereotype, Cognition, and African American English. And I look forward to talking to you a bit about my work in a bunch of different arenas. Please feel free to make any comments or thoughts that you have in the chat or keep them in mind for the end of the talk. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but of course, if you feel called to say something at some point, feel free to type it in and I'll look at it when I complete the talk. So let's get going. So I like to start my talks with this intersection for clarity, as I'm a sociolinguist investigating processing and multidialectalism. And my work falls within this intersection of sociolinguistics, cognitive processing, and race. And I engage with variation and social cognition to better understand how American English speaking listeners cognitively interact with Black and white individuals. So my work demonstrates that matters of inequity are not independent of cognitive processing, and these issues are inextricably linked. And I look forward to telling you more about that. And I think, importantly, having a model that incorporates minoritized varieties of language gives us insight into explicit and implicit linguistic knowledge that we have and a better understanding of the processing complexities across multiple dialects, which benefits linguistics more broadly. Again, my research program broadly asks, how do American English speaking listeners cognitively interact with voices from Black and white individuals? And within that are some other questions as they relate to language use, perception, processing, and cognition. Today, I'll focus on my emotional prosody processing research, which together bring the pieces of this puzzle that I'm putting together as I think broadly about cognition, identity, and perception. So this stream of research that I'll be talking about with you regards how does perception of race influence perception of emotion? And in this work, I operationalize the Angry Black Woman Trope, which exemplifies this intersectionality with respect to race and affect on the stereotype side. I think about this in the frame of prosody because there's so much gleaned from that level of linguistic interaction. So for those of us who are not familiar with the term prosody, prosody is a suprasegmental feature that can convey prominence and emphasis in speech. So for example, if I say the word in English that is spelled H-E-L-L-O, H-E-L-L-O, I could say that word in many different ways. Hello, hello, hello. All of these are the same words, right? But we are hearing a different melody and tone with each of the ways that I say that, which in turn glean a different meaning. And this is what prosody is, looking at the ways in which these words are said, not necessarily the words or speech sounds themselves. And so thinking about emotional prosody specifically, it's been defined as the emotion-specific prosodic patterns that elicit listener perceptions in various emotional states. In the research looking at emotional prosody thus far, which isn't very broad, happiness and sadness are typically the binary emotions of focus. And at this point, we know from the literature that emotion can be gleaned from speech, but lack of experience with a language or variety of that speech is produced in can make that specific emotion detection difficult. We've seen this from Pell and Skorup's work, looking at a monolingual English-speaking participant listening to pseudo-Arabic words. So again, this monolingual English-speaking participants were listening to pseudo-Arabic words being said in multiple types of emotional prosody. They were able to glean that emotion was coming through, but what type of emotion, they were not able to tell. We also know that emotional prosody can map directly onto social concepts and representations, thereby influencing the spoken word process, evidenced by Kim and Sumner's work using a reaction time study indicating that angry prosody, when preceded by a non-emotional word uttered in angry prosody, results in affective priming. So an example of that is if I hear the word pineapple, but I hear it in an angry tone, like pineapple. And then I see the word frustrated show up on the screen. And I'm asked to click the button anytime I see a word that's associated with how the emotion sounds. People were much more quickly able to press the space bar. So again, the reaction time when they saw frustrated after hearing angry pineapple, than if they heard angry pineapple. So again, pineapple, and then saw the phrase enjoyment or something like this. So again, angry associated words after hearing a semantically neutral word uttered in an emotional state resulted in this affective priming. But we don't see this same result happening in this work to happy or neutral speech. So again, hearing perhaps the word pineapple said in a happy tone followed by excited didn't result in the same kind of affective priming that we saw with angry speech and angry words. And one reason the authors thought that maybe this, we weren't seeing the same type of effect is because maybe neutral sounding speech, for example, sounds happy enough, especially coming from a woman's voice that's already stereotyped as agreeable and friendly sounding, as we know from the literature on gender and language. But this sparked for me questions considering the sociocultural environment of the United States, and I sought to operationalize the angry Black woman trope to refine the ways and the kinds of results that we see in this previous work as it relates to this link between emotional perception and race perception. So not everybody who speaks the same words in the same emotional states are going to be perceived as the same. So I want to give us a quick rundown on what the angry Black woman trope is and why I find it to be important, an important window through which to examine the cognitive processing of African American English. As listener ideologies about certain speaking groups inevitably inform their perceptions, we have to keep in mind the social variables when looking at perception and processing. I want to quickly share with you some images, and the images that I share today come specifically from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris State University, which is located in Big Rapids, Michigan. So, the angry Black woman trope is deeply entrenched in American society and is still pervasive today. With its origins in slave times, the angry Black woman trope caricatured enslaved women who were forced to suppress their emotion. And when women did express anger, they were labeled as aggressive or overbearing, later seen as sassy mammies and sexualized as well. There's been work a little bit from linguists in this field, particularly Marceliana Morgan, who has said that one of the reasons that this trope has sparsely been studied, especially particularly by linguists, is because it's maybe been accepted to be true. And so, again, Black women often end up in situations in which they are discriminated against, regardless of socioeconomic status, due to this pervasive concept that Black women are degenerate and violent. And there are upsettingly too many examples in the American context of discrediting Black women based on how they speak, again, regardless of their financial background, the way that they speak, even if it varies from one another, how these women are perceived with regard to their speech has been treated pretty much the same, where we've seen decades of audiences, Supreme Court members, and juries finding the testimonies of Black women not credible, inauthentic, and at worst, incomprehensible. We've even seen this with Vice President Kamala Harris during the Brett Kavanaugh trials and also during her debates on the vice presidential debate stage. Outside of the courtroom as well, perceptions of Black women's speech can have life-threatening consequences, and I think it's important to talk about. So there's a paper from Gill in 2015 called "The Killing of an Angry Black Woman, Sandra Bland and the Politics of Respectability." This paper outlines the surprising death of Sandra Bland, and puts forth a critical eye toward the legality of her arrest. So at the time of her arrest, Bland was pulled over, but did not get out of her car or put out her cigarette when the officer asked her to, saying things like, "I'm in my car, why do I have to put out my cigarette?" And he said things to her like, "You seem very irritated," and things of this nature. There was this idea that Bland was already a threatening individual just because of these stereotypes that Black women are inherently belligerent, and it is an expectation that Black women will be harder to control. And so when we think about this discourse context between Bland and the officer, we see this death of a perceived angry Black woman resulting from the perceptions that were in play during this interaction. So again, I think it's crucial to be bringing these things up as I frame the research, because we have to examine the influence of stereotypes on emotional prosody perception as we interrogate the effects of linguistic ideology broadly when it comes to perception and production. So for this first study I want to share with you, where I operationalized the angry Black woman trope to see if pervasive emotional stereotypes hold when listening to emotional speech from two different women, one that speaks standardized American English and one that speaks African American English. I had three general hypotheses regarding this work. So if stereotypes do in fact influence how the emotional prosody is perceived, then race judgment should interact with emotion judgments. So specifically, I mean that happy guises would be perceived as more white, angry guises would be perceived as more Black. And I also had a hypothesis that the neutral Black guys would be perceived as more angry than neutral white. Again, trying to look at this intersection of what does happy enough mean, and will happy enough, if we're presuming that, hold across these different populations that we're talking about. So participants listened to tokens from an AAE speaking woman, African American English speaking woman, and a standardized American English speaking woman, SdAE, in happy, angry, and neutral prosodies. And they were asked to explicitly indicate the perceived race and emotion of each speaker. So let me show you what these tokens looked like. So these were single words, and I'll be able to play some for you when I talk a bit about the results so you can hear them for yourself. But these were the semantically non-emotional words that were thus uttered in angry, happy, and neutral prosodies. So again, you can see pineapple at the center of this one. So think pineapple, pineapple, pineapple. And so I will also say that this is the same word list that I was used in that previous work from Kim and Sumner. So again, for the experimental procedure, like I said, participants listened to tokens from both speakers across the three different types of prosody, and they were asked explicitly to say which race that they thought the participant was, and they did have a binary choice, Black or white, and then also mood. So they had happy, angry, neutral. And then also at the end of this, they had a post-survey questionnaire about their language history, each participant's language history. So let's talk about what happened in these results. So the results from this study indicated that the Black speaker was most correctly identified as Black when the token was said in an angry or neutral tone. And the white speaker was most correctly identified as white when the token was said in a happy tone. Okay, so this goes along with hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. But it's not that simple. The results also indicated a disconnect between rating the voices correctly for race and rating the voices for emotion perception in the long form responses from the participants in the questionnaire that we asked them to do. So again, some lower base rates in terms of getting the race correct for the individual, but then saying different things in the post questionnaire. So I'll tell you what I mean by that, which I would frame as some kind of I don't see race, I don't hear race stance. So in the long form responses, when we asked participants what they thought the study was about, I got some pretty rich quotes, such as, when the voice was higher and with positive enunciation, I tend to lean towards white, but when it was a bit aggressive or lax in pronunciation, I leaned towards Black. And so again, there's this meta-linguistic awareness of these variations that are steeped in ideology from the participants. And yet during the study, when asked what's the speaker's race, there seemed to be some difficulty acknowledging explicitly, oh, this does sound like a Black speaker, or this sounds like a white speaker. So I will say, given the explicit nature of the task, i.e. asking what the race and emotion the token is associated with, the results indicate that while perception of race did influence perception of emotion, implicit processing models would give us a greater sense of how people are processing these different varieties, given the pervasive ideologies surrounding the stereotypes. So when I say an implicit processing model, what I mean is not asking them directly to identify who is speaking. I'm saying something more cognitive, some more quick response where we don't need them to say it, and we can get a sense of the implicit biases that are happening in play. I would also say including multiple speakers of each variety would have helped better determine if listeners' responses in this particular study were to the individual or to the language variety themselves. So were these responses just to individual variation, or can we spread this out to make a broader claim of how people are interacting with language varieties more broadly? Additionally, too, Participants have different perspectives and experiences in their lives that they bring to an experimental space. And so a measure of experience with African American English would provide a more fine-grained clarity on how perception of race may influence cognition with respect to the speech signal and stereotype influence. So I'll tell you a bit about how I worked some of those quandaries in the next experiment, but I want to be able to play for you the audio. So let me pull those up for you quickly now. So I'm going to play all 6 for you, and then I can tell you a little bit more about them. So I'll play each audio twice. So this is the word after, one of the semantically non-emotional tokens.
After. 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 After.
So I intentionally, didn't tell you which was which, but you can be mulling over in your head. Maybe you already were. Who is speaking and what what emotional prosody are they using in each one? So the first three were the white speaker, standardized American English speaker, saying happy, or saying angry, happy, and neutral. And then the second pair were was the African American English speaker using angry, happy, and neutral. There we go. I can play them one more time for you.
After. 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 After.
So maybe you're hearing some other things now that I've given you more of the social information. But anyway, we can move on to some other work that I did in this arena, but based on some of the things I discussed with you there. Something I will also say is that there is work in the sociolinguistic literature that tells us that even within a single word, we can glean a lot of information about an individual's background, their race, their age, their socioeconomic status, their emotion, and so on. And so thinking about here, how much are we gleaning from this space? Importantly too, and I'm not going to talk about this work today, but when we think about the different levels of of language that we have, so the way our grammar, our semantics, our meaning, our phonology, our sounds, our prosody, the ways that our melody sounds, we have these we have these different parts of speech. And again, this idea of if we hear these certain particular parts that can indicate to us certain identity markers, we need to think more deeply about what that actually means. Because in some other work that I've done, we have Black speakers who are using standardized American English grammatical forms and yet are still being read as Black, which indicates to us that there's something else going on within the speech signal, whether or not you are using the grammar of a different variety. So again, different people can get perceived, one person can get perceived differently depending on the language variety they use, and one language variety can get read as different depending on what which individual is actually producing the language. So we could talk more about that, but I bring that up to say here, I used individual words here for this study. And for the next study that I did, I actually used full sentences, and I call them semantically neutral sentences, which I had pre-tested. So let's move on a little bit to think about explicit versus implicit experimental measures and processing. Because again, in this last study, I had shown, here's an explicit task where we're asking people what's the race and what's the emotion for the person that you're hearing. So let's think about some implicit models as well and the pros and cons of both of these. So eliciting unbiased and unprimed responses from participants in an experimental setting is a challenging task. And there are explicit and implicit modes of elicitation, and each has its benefits and drawbacks. Experiments don't exist in a vacuum. And not only do participants bring their own knowledge to the experiment room, but as I said, also lived experiences, ideologies, and stereotypes. Evidence from studies that ask participants explicit questions and tasks have proven to be fruitful for some linguistic questions, and it's clear that more experience with a language variety results in greater ease of processing. And that relates to what I was saying earlier about gleaning emotional prosody, particularly from a language we are more or less familiar with. We also know that social information from speech can result in racialization, meaning that a listener assigns to an individual race in the moment after receiving enough information to make their subjective standard to make a conclusion about race as they, such as identity to work from, excuse me. So neurolinguistic evidence, again, which I won't talk about today, shows that people draw on social knowledge during sentence processing, which influences the social categorization of the speaker in relation to the speech signal. But few studies have looked at the focus of emotional prosody processing and are somewhat vague regarding looking at how emotional prosody is elicited during stimuli creation and things like this. So if folks are interested in that, I'll be talking about that more at the end. But this idea of, okay, we're looking at what does a happy voice sound like? What does an angry voice sound like? What do these sound like coming from different people? How do we quantify that? How do we figure that out? I'll tell you about some ideas I have about that at the end. But as far as current research that exists, in most methodologies, you'll read in journal articles that people say, we told our stimuli creator people to say these words in X emotion, and then we pre-tested that to ask 100 people how did they find the emotion of the individual. So that's usually how people are getting their stimuli to be created. But one study in particular from Liu et al. Hypothesized that listeners make judgments about speakers rapidly given linguistic data and perceived identity information with relation to emotion. And they found that English-speaking North American participants showed a greater interference from irrelevant faces than Chinese participants, who showed more interference with irrelevant voices. And so they found that these display roles, here defined as a central role of communication resulting in varied emotional prosody perception, can show that these varied cultural linguistic experiences inform how we're interacting with one another. So again, if with these different participants that had these different backgrounds, they were tuning into different parts of the experimental design, whether it was the varied faces or the varied voices that they were listening to. And thus, I began to consider the implicit measures for emotional prosody processing to better understand the intersection of linguistic stereotype and perception. And I executed this study that I will tell you about now. So this study looks at the implicit processing of race and emotion through virtual eye tracking. So again, virtual eye tracking is a really awesome tool to be used by researchers, not only for many reasons, some of which including the COVID-19 pandemic for individuals that want to be able to do experimental research and not bring people into the experiment room. But regardless of the pandemic situation, it allows for a broader access of who can be a participant in an experiment, as long as someone has a laptop with a camera on it or bringing a laptop to whoever might not have one. So it broadens our abilities to think about populations worked with and types of questions that we want to ask. So in this work, I investigated how varied linguistic knowledge modulates the level of racialization and associated social stereotypes an individual invokes during online processing of emotional speech. Excuse me there. So for this experiment, 80 participants were asked to take part in a 4-part online study, which included an eye tracking section, 2 Qualtrics surveys, and the sociolinguistic Zoom interview to garner experience metrics of exposure, familiarity, and usage of African American English from each participant. And here's some examples of what the exposure and familiarity questionnaires looked like. So again, these were meant to garner the types of questions relating to exposure and familiarity with each person that they were listening to in the survey But of course, we were only interested in their responses to the African-American English-speaking woman. Then also, I will talk more about the usage in the usage interviews after this. But what I want to show you is these images, because I ended up incorporating an image component, again, which would be needed with virtual eye tracking. So I had happy and angry sentence stimuli coming from 3 SdAE speaking women, 3 standardized American English speaking women, and 3 African American English speaking women, and 12 images that you see here that were aligned with each speaker. And the task asked individuals to look at the screen at who they thought was speaking after a sentence played in their earphones. So I'll quickly show you what the sentences looked like before I showed you in that previous study what individual words looked like. And here we have these semantically pre-tested neutral sentences. So again, each stimuli creator said these sentences in a happy tone and in an angry tone. This image here shows about a trial and a half. So if we start at the center of the screen, you can see the image along with that has a speaker there to show you what audio they were listening to, and also a fixation cross on the screen. So participants listened to a sentence from one of the pieces of stimuli, and then they were faced with one of these paired images here. So if we had individuals of the same racial background, they would vary in their emotion indicated on their face. If we had individuals on the screen that varied in race, they would have identical emotion on their faces for reference. And I'd be happy to talk more about the experimental paradigm if that's of interest to folks. But again, the virtual eye tracker accounted for when participants were looking at the right or left of the screen. Again, they were listening to a sentence from one of these participants, and they were asked to look at the right or the left of the screen, depending on who they thought was talking. But of course, we're interested in where do their eyes automatically go as soon as they hear the stimuli themselves. Importantly, again, with the virtual eye tracker, lots of benefits, but also some other issues to keep in mind as well. If they were looking at neither the right or the left of the screen, let's say they were looking above their computer, or their child came to ask them a question, or they wanted to get a sip of water, that was not accounted for from the virtual eye tracker, and thus some participants' glances in left and right didn't equal 100%, if that makes sense. 150 participants were initially recruited via a snowball sample with online recruitment materials sent out to professors at universities across the country to disseminate to their students, as well as encouragement to share by word of mouth. And as with many studies, there's often an issue of attrition to be dealt with online studies, especially when I had 4 parts to the study. And so I ended up having 150 initially recruited and 80 participants successfully completing the entire study. And so the results herein that I'll be talking about are the data that come from these 80 participants. And so participants ranged in their free write responses for ethnic backgrounds, which you can see here, where, so again, I actually in this iteration of this work didn't give participants a list of racial identity background to say. I had them free write fill it in themselves. And you can see one of them was human. That's what they chose to identify their background. And so on. You also see multiracial, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian, Black, White, Caucasian. Anything else I want to say about this? No. So yes, you can see here, I guess I will say that it was a semi-representative, equally representative sample, but we still see that we have majority white participants in the study coming in at 35% of the sample. So I wanted to talk a bit about the usage score. So the participants, so when I was trying to garner, how do we quantify experience from participants? That's a challenging task. How do we quantify someone's experience with a variety of a language and see how their experience aligns with their ability to correctly or incorrectly identify voices and faces together? So to do this, I decided to quantify experience using exposure, familiarity, and usage surveys. Usage metrics. So the exposure and familiarity came from surveys. Like I said, I had participants listen to 10 different women who come from all over the world speaking all varieties of Englishes across the world, say one passage, and then I would have them answer questions like the ones I showed a little bit earlier, relating to exposure to that, to way of speaking or familiarity with that way of speaking. For the usage score, this was a bit more straightforward and to the point and very exciting. So for the usage metric, I actually did sociolinguistic interviews with each of my participants. And as we know, so in sociolinguistics, the sociolinguistic interview is a great opportunity to interact with participants and give them an opportunity to speak in their most natural register possible. So what I ended up doing with this is I had 15-minute interviews with each participant, and then I took the 5 center minutes within our interview together, and then I coded that each interview for features of African-American English, again, across all participants. We know that African-American English is pervasive and innovative in the United States historically, and often co-opted by those who do and don't speak, who do not speak the variety. So again, this was the goal is to look at everyone's speech and quantify the number of usage features of the variety within each interview to see if higher rates of usage resulted in more correct looking preferences. So here I just have some examples of some of the features of African-American English that I looked at. If we have any eye tracking people in the house that are interested in, was there a looking preference to the left versus to the right during the study, I have this image here for you. And so this image depicts the average looking preferences for each participant who are represented by a black dot, each of them. The y-axis named value indicates the percentage of time looking at the left side of the screen. The x-axis named name indicates the percentage on the left and the percentage on the right. This figure depicts, again, variability within looking preferences, though on average participants as a whole did seem to be looking left almost equally as right, with a slight preference toward the left as indicated with the error bars here. So let's talk a bit about what my scoring and predictions were for this study. So a bias score, or BS, was computed to quantify the difference in looking times as a function of emotion. And so I have what this scoring looked like here for you. And now this resulted in a single BS score per participant. And the exposure score, or ES, as you'll see it on the results slide, and familiarity score, as you'll see as FS on the next slide, were quantified by coding the survey answers as to where they indicated more or less exposure or familiarity with African-American English. So for example, the sentence, "I often encounter people who speak this way," was scored as a +1, whereas "I don't know anyone who speaks this way" was scored as a -1. And the sum of these scores to these questions of each of these two surveys defined the ES and FS scores respectively. And the usage score, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, was defined based on the 5-minute chunk of speech analyzed from the sociolinguistic interview. So that was just a simple percentage number. How much did you use this over the time of the 5 minutes? And then BS was then merged with FS, ES, and US. And again, ratio-linguistic stereotyping based on the Angry Black Woman trope was then evaluated using a set of linear regressions between each of these 3 experience scores and BS. It was predicted that participants would be least likely to look at the Black happy face overall because of the pervasiveness of the Angry Black Woman trope in the consciousness of American ideology broadly. But it was also predicted that people with more experience with African-American English would show more correct alignment with Black happy faces and Black happy prosodic speech than those with less experience. So again, the overall, what we're looking for here is, does more experience with African-American English result in less biased or biased looking? So here are the virtual eye tracking results. I can give you a second to look at them while I take a sip, and then I'll explain them. So I'll orient you to this graph again. So this is a side-by-side comparison of all experience scores and their relationship to bias scores. The lower the number on the y-axis means the less biased looking the participant made, and the further to the right on the x-axis meant the higher experience measure, whether that's exposure, familiarity, or usage. Again, FS, ES, and US as represented here. And each dot, again, represents one of the 80 participants in the study's average correct looking preferences from all of 288 trials per participant. And so the results from this study indicate that participants, as we can see here, varied greatly in their looking patterns via the virtual eye tracker and also in their experiential knowledge with African American English. Excitedly and interestingly, only the usage score was at significance statistically regarding predicting bias scores. The results overall indicate how language variety, stereotyping, and racialization play parts in how processing can illuminate these types of trends. And again, this isn't surprising, as the perception literature and linguistics has shown how exposure can modulate perception and social attribution. But again, so this takeaway here is that experience with African American English can influence lowering of bias towards AAE speakers. And of course, as you can see here, again, we have this at significance result, but we also have lots of variability on the edge of people that are not using as much African American English. And so I would be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A about what we think might be going on there. So let's talk a little bit more about these results. So again, this goal of this study was to investigate how variation in experiential knowledge would predict bias in emotional prosody processing through virtual eye tracking. And the results of the study indicate, again, at significance, that people who have higher experiential linguistic knowledge of African American English with respect to usage show more accurate looking times quantified in terms of lower bias scores in this virtual eye tracking paradigm. But the statistics show that these results may be difficult to generalize beyond this sample, especially as we are thinking about the other experience scores as well. Now, there are many interpretations regarding the study's outcome, and the most pertinent of those, I think, would be the eye tracker itself. So Gorilla FC, the website, states that their platform, which uses WebGaze, the virtual eye tracker, does not currently have any studies published using the virtual eye tracking method, and it's still in beta testing. So it's exciting that there's room for exploration regarding the accuracy and reliability of the method. And it's possible, though, that virtual eye tracking measures may be noisier than lab-based in-person tools, which could have offsets the bias scores given the multiple potential distractions that an individual has at home versus the experiment room. So again, if someone's looking above their computer or to the right or to the left or need to go to the restroom, any of these things could potentially get in the way of the kinds of results that we're seeing. Importantly as well, the context of having a experience score as well is quite interesting. So again, it was important to me to be able to quantify people's experiences and how those relate to their perception and processing of the variety. I often get questions with my work about how do Black people respond differently than white people? And I try to push back on that and say for two reasons. One, it's not as simple as how someone's identity background influences how they're going to perceive language. It's really about their life experiences and their familiarity that will, I believe, influence the way in which they perceive and process language. But additionally to that as well, there are these ideological frames within the American society with which I look at very broadly, such that we have these standard language ideologies about what way is correct to speak English and which ways are considered not correct. And these are pervasive for people of all language backgrounds because it is what is taught in schools and things like this. And so trying to operationalize this idea of what is the broad ideology, but then also how do people's experiences day to day thus influence what's happening in interaction with others in the experimental frame, I think can give us a better sense of what's actually going on in cognition further than just what somebody's background might mean. And so with that, I looked at familiarity, experience, exposure, and usage. And I would love to hear about in the Q&A if people have other thoughts about other ways to try to quantify experience for future experimental work as well. But in sum, when we think about this question of how American English speaking listeners cognitively interact with voices from Black and white individuals, study 1, I showed you that angry voices were perceived as Black and happy voices were perceived as white. Please ignore the as angry part at the end of that. Sorry to be confusing. And study 2 showed that more experience with African American English as it relates to usage specifically here can result in less biased perceptions. And so when I think about conclusions to share that we've learned here more broadly for the field, it's clear that people use their sociolinguistic knowledge consciously or not to make decisions during sentence processing. And people have knowledge of all kinds, especially of linguistic variation, and they leverage that knowledge during processing and they bring that to bear when they come into conversation with one another. Again, calling back to this interaction between Sandra Bland and the officer, what kinds of knowledge are being brought to bear within those interactions linguistically. And finally, as well, minoritized language varieties as a focus of study is important and crucial because it informs the field of what the human language faculty is capable of recognizing and processing. And if we want to model how language exists in the real world, we need to be including a multidialectal frame in order to do that. So I'll share a little bit about works in progress. So again, I talked a bit earlier, I had previewed that I'm thinking a bit about how can we glean emotion in speech? What is it that makes a Black speaker sound Black? What is it that makes any person sound angry or sound happy? And how do those vary intersectionally? And so one question I had is, can speech devoid of words elicit perceptions of emotion in and to African American English speech? And what I mean by that is low pass filtered speech, which might not be a familiar term to many of us. And so I described earlier, when we think about language, we think about the syntax, semantics, phonetics, phonology. So the grammar that's used, the meaning that is gleaned, the speech sounds that exist. And if we are to take away some of these different lines that make up what language is and leave only, say, the melody of the speech, can we still glean certain identity information? So one hypothesis I have is that prosody only, or the melody, so that would be from low pass speech, could elicit perceptions of emotion aligned with stereotypes across African American English and standardized American English. But an alternative hypothesis is that low pass speech does not elicit perceptions of emotion differently across varieties. And I bring both of these to bear because, again, we have this literature from the sociolinguistics historically that tells us that when we give participants the identical stimuli, but give one group information that we don't give the other group. So for example, Najilski's work in 1999 with Detroiter speech, but telling half of the group that they're hearing Canadians, all of a sudden, the group who was told that they're hearing Canadian speech says that, oh, I hear all of these vowels, they sound so different from me, when in fact they were listening to Detroit speech themselves. So again, is there something actually going on within the speech signal that's indicating different identity markers? I want to be able to find out, and it is an open question. So let me play some of these examples for you. So let me play one here.
And has a college prep course this week.
I'll play this again. So again, this is low pass speech where I've taken away the syntax, the words, just left the melody.
And has a college prep course this week. Andy has a college prep course this week. Andy has a college prep course this week.
Okay, I'm going to play them both with everything back in them now.
Andy has a college prep course this week. Andy has a college prep course this week.
Andy has a college prep course this week. Andy has a college prep course this week.
So here again, I have the first person that I played was a Black woman. The second one was a white woman, and then same order, but low passed. So I'm not sure, you have to think for yourself, what could you glean during those low passed or speech devoid of words scenarios here? Again, this is something that is currently in progress that I'm working on in the speech perception production lab at University of Oregon. So looking forward to having some results to maybe come back to Rutgers and tell you about next time, which would be great. One last work in progress that I'll mention is actually work that I'm doing in the developmental social neuroscience lab at the University of Oregon, which asks, what are the linguistic markers of emotional speech in adolescent girls? And so this work is looking specifically at co-rumination. And so this is a process, dyadic process of discourse. So we think two girls that are talking to each other about the problems that are going on in their life, some negative things that are happening in school, talking about these things excessively. And what I'm looking at is to see, do co-ruminative conversations look acoustically or linguistically different than conversations that are not co-ruminative, to give us a sense of how we might be able to, if we know what these conversations consist of in these ways, how could we modify these types of conversations to then protect these girls when on the clinical side, there's evidence to show that co-ruminative conversation can lead to internalizing problems such as depression and anxiety within these girls. And if one girl has depression and the other one doesn't, but they're having co-ruminative conversations, we can see some kind of what they call pathologized depression contagion, where now this other girl is just developing some of these internalizing symptoms too. There's exciting stuff to say about this work, and it's really great. I love having this interdisciplinary postdoc because I get to ask and learn all of these different ways to think about language from these different lenses. But I'll touch on again, specifically as we think about melody of speech and prosody, the previous work that's been done on co-rumination from the psychology lens often is looking at sentiment analysis. So what are the girls saying in these one conversations versus the others? So again, I'm trying to look at a different level of what is the prosodic variation? What's the speech rate? How fast are they talking? What is the mean pitch? Is there variability there? Which also then in terms of experimental design could allow for less privacy issues or concerns. So if we wanted girls to wear perhaps like a wearable technology to hear them in conversations of co-rumination versus not, we're not going to be tuning into what they were talking about, but more how they were saying it. So this could also allow us to have access to greater populations. So super exciting work, which again, I would love to come back one day and tell you how this work works out, because I forgot the last part of it that I wanted to say, which was in addition to getting a sense of what's going on here, also looking at our different populations co-ruminating differently, and will they do it differently depending on the interlocutor that they're talking to. So if someone is speaking the same variety of English versus not. So that's what I have for you, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you in this Q&A. So thanks, and this is my info.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, let's all give Rachel a virtual round of applause. So Rachel's okay fielding her own questions, but feel free to also put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we get those to her as well.
Rachel, this was really, really fantastic, and it raises so many questions, both with respect to like the relationship between language and identity, and how we take affect and encode that into our interpretation of somebody's utterance, which I think is really fantastic from a pragmatic perspective. A lot of the work that I've been doing in the recent years has been looking at perspective taking, adjectives with some kind of subjectivity encoded into their lexical semantic representation, and the way in which contextual information influences our interpretation of individual lexical items and sentences. And so I was thinking a lot about what it means for these speakers to have been assessed as angry or happy or whatever, but let's just focus on angry. And I'm wondering, like, at what level that assessment of them being angry actually infiltrates the meaning, or the kind of the meaning that you, like, as you said, like the interlocutor gleans from their utterance, right? So I was actually relating this back to other work that I've done on the way that prosody influences truth values. And we, in my lab, my former student and I found this really puzzling finding where a negative prosody with particular kinds of adjectives actually flips the truth value, where it doesn't do that to a comparable statement with the same kind of prosody with a noun instead of a gradable adjective or a context-dependent adjective. So like if I say to you something like, Rachel's girlfriend gave her mums. And like mums is not like the kind of flower that like you'd want, right? Like, you know, it's going to be like, I love you, here's some mums, right? And so like, if I say to you, like, she got mums, like that kind of prosody is like, I'm giving you my perspective on the situation, right? But if I say to you, but still the proposition, she got mums, is true, presumably, right? If you think that I'm kind of adhering to like the Gricean maxims and all that. But if I say something like, yeah, we went on a trip, it was fun, then it's like, it's not fun, right? So somehow that like negative prosody, and I'm being kind of wishy-washy here, negative prosody, it's like interacting with the lexical interpretation of this context-dependent adjective in a way that it doesn't with the noun, right? So then I started thinking, like, for these speakers who are assessed as angry, like, is that anger, like, is it taken as being like just their mood? Like if like, you know, if an African-American woman is perceived as being angry, like, is it just like, okay, she's angry, but like when she says that was fun, she really means it was fun, she's just angry? Or is it like doing the same thing in terms of like flipping the truth value? So I'm just wondering like where that affect is kind of creeping into interpretation.
I'm like, my mind is blown. I
want to collaborate, but like, like, what do you think? Like, this is so cool.
Yes, so I was just saying the same thing, as I can't wait to email you to talk about collaborating, because I have lots of thoughts about further experiments where I could frame them in these paradigms that you're describing. Because that's still an open question here. We're getting a sense that, okay, anger is being gleaned, but we don't actually know what is being pointed toward. Again, I feel like I end up looking to I end up looking to the social world, right? I try to be clear. You know, people often ask me, where do I align myself as a linguist? And I say I'm a sociolinguist, and I care about how cognition works, but it's like social cognition, and we can't have or understand cognition without understanding the social. So I say that because, you know, when we look at something like the Trayvon Martin case, which if folks have not read, Language and Linguistics on Trial from Rickford and King, 2016, great book, paper, won best paper in language. But they look at Rachel Gentile, who was the, you know, IQ witness, and how her testimony was completely thrown out and not considered by the jury for reasons of, oh, we don't understand her. Oh, we don't understand the way this person speaks, when it's an African-American person, actually also Haitian Creole individual. And there was lots, like 6 hours of testimony there where they're grilling her and asking her to repeat and saying she's not comprehensible and misunderstood. So we're seeing here that even if there's, again, thinking again about the truth values that you're talking about here, like obviously in a court setting, you're supposed to be only telling the truth, nothing but the truth. But yet, just by virtue of who she is as a person speaking in this space, she is getting treated this way. So I'm inclined to believe that the affect perception is coming from the stereotype and ideology, but I think we would need to have more fine-grained experiments to really hone in and make those kinds of claims. So I want to think about them in the way that you're bringing them up here. An opposing example, which, you know, is might not be familiar to some younger folks in the space, but thinking about Anita Hill, and when she was on talking to the Supreme Court, when they were talking about bringing in Clarence Thomas. So again, we're talking about a completely different individual, someone who speaks a standard that is perceived as the right way of speaking in an ideological sense in the US. But the aftermath, there is some linguistics work from Norma Mendoza-Denton, particularly, about how she was speaking and perceived not only by white people, but by Black people, saying things like, she doesn't sound like any Black woman I know. Oh, she sounds inauthentic. Oh, I think she might be lying. And again, she's using standard speech there. So that's why I think it's important to frame, again, it's when Black women, this is my like ultimate research life goal. How can a Black woman, despite any background that she has, be treated as credible, be seen as she's telling the truth, and respected like anybody else. But I think those two opposing examples, to me, get at the social frame of it's ideology and stereotype that's influencing how that emotion is coming across. But let's collaborate to think further about how we can further get at these questions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Ariana. I haven't seen you in a while. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Hey, Rachel. This was such a great talk. Thank you so much. Like, just really, really amazing. Really excited about all of this. So I'm really interested in personally in the relationship between racial stereotypes and linguistic perception and sociolinguistic perception. So I'm really curious, what do you personally see as the relationship between people's experience with language varieties and their endorsement of racial stereotypes? So for example, the Angry Black Woman stereotype, what is there room in your sort of research for questions about, do people know this stereotype's even a thing? What is their endorsement of it? Are they aware of it as a cultural phenomenon? Where does that fit?
So I think this is a good question. And I should actually, I guess, say, I didn't necessarily at all ask my participants at the beginning, do you know what this trope is? Or even ask them after it. I've been coming at a lot of this work, again, thinking from the social frame of what are the ideologies that are existing in the American space? What are people holding? African-American English speakers themselves don't find it to be, by and large, a variety that's acceptable or even legitimate or innovative, as we know that it continues to be an influenced standardized American English. And so I've come at this so far from that ideological frame, and then trying, at least in the most recent work with the eye tracking, to quantify what experience looks like with the variety. But thinking about experience or knowledge of these tropes and figuring out how to ask them, and especially in the experimental setting, finding what time to ask them that question so as not to bias them towards the next point, I think would be really helpful towards what you're talking about. I mean, a lot of the work in the sociolinguistic literature is showing us that more knowledge equals ease of processing, or if we do a learning paradigm, if we have enough information, we're going to be able to get the task a lot more quickly than we could at the beginning. So I could surmise that people's more experience with any varieties might, again, lessen bias or stereotyping. It could also go the other way. I mean, there's folks that may have experience, but maybe not close relationships. So there's a difference between being in the space with people that are different than you and actually knowing people that are different than you. So trying to find a way to quantify that, I think, would be really important, and maybe get at some of the questions that you have. But I hope that kind of points at your questions a little bit, Ariana. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a quick question, I guess concerning maybe future studies or something. By the way, my name is Javi. Are you thinking about doing any studies around police interactions with people of color, and maybe how their perceptions of, I guess, what they hear or see in terms of people of color? Because I think that would be interesting to know, why so many young people of color are killed or, injured by police officers who usually tend to be white.
It's a great question, and crucial, and what I hope that doing the linguistics work on this side can actually have in the applied settings. So I have not done that work. Dr. Nicole Holliday at University of Pennsylvania, I believe, has started to do some work on this. I believe, I'm not sure where it is, but I know that there is some work being done. Again, her name is Dr. Nicole Holliday, that's done some of this work. On the other side of this, there's been linguists such as Dr. Sharice King at University of Chicago, who has been in the courtrooms working on training court transcribers on how to transcribe in various different ways in various Englishes that you have of people on the stand, because we have plenty of information, and they talk about it in the Language and Linguistics on Trial in their background section about in Australia, in Australian Englishes, and Aboriginal folks that are coming into being tried are getting heard differently or heard incorrectly, and then are having different sentencing outcomes because there was a lack of understanding across participants or across people there. Again, I think there's a broader question of, is it about intelligibility, or is racism, prejudice, causing people to do what they want to do, even if they understand people clearly. That's another reason why I really like the implicit processing work, because again, in that Rachel Gentile situation, you can say you don't understand her, but if we can see in certain ways that we look at cognition, whether it's through EEG, MEG, eye tracking, and so on, if we can see, oh no, there's actually, you're actually able to do this cognitive processing of grammar correctly, it's that there are these other pieces here that are causing you to say you don't understand. It can give us greater insight into what are these biases. But yes, I mean, if someone doesn't do it by the time I have the chance to, I will definitely, because we need to be implementing this work or having our students do it. Thanks for bringing it.
Very cool. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. Carly.
Hi, Rachel. Could you talk more about who your talkers were for the stimuli? How many, I wasn't sure if you mentioned how many different talkers you had. And I guess I was kind of wondering, when it came to prosody, did you find that your African-American English speakers were doing, like, were they doing happy different prosody? Was that accomplishing happy for them than the standard American English speakers, or did that not have any effect?
So these are good questions. And the first study is hopefully going to be published soon. So I'll have all of that info in there for more like fine-grained, details on like mean pitch and things like that. But so for the first study, I only had one speaker of standardized American English and one speaker of African-American English, both women in their late 20s from San Diego, California. For the second study, I had 3 standardized American English speaking women and 3 African-American English speaking women, all in their 20s and 30s, with varied backgrounds in the United States. Yeah, there we go. And you had another question there. Oh, yeah. So I did look at mean pitch and creak variation for the first study to see if there was anything particularly variable about them that like make one accomplish angry or happy different than the other. And I didn't find for those two. However, there's more to be looked at in the speech signal besides mean pitch and creak variation. So again, these future studies looking at what's going on within the melody, what are all of the different aspects of speech where we might see how these different ways of doing emotion are different acoustically, is still to be done. Perhaps a project for someone's dissertation, but I will continue doing it in this frame as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful presentation and talk and generating this great discussion, and for being here tonight. I have a question about how you incorporate your research into your courses and students' response, and if they participate, are active participants in this type of sociolinguistic research, and you can give examples of different classes, whatever you teach, and how, or any example that you have for how you integrate this into your undergrad and graduate classes.
Yes, thank you. So haven't had the opportunity to teach graduate students yet, but very excited to do that in the future. So yeah, my current work that I've done in teaching is for undergraduate students, and I've taught many courses, whether it's Introduction to Linguistics, Language and Power, Language and Discrimination, and so on, word peeves and things like this. What I like to do in Introduction to Linguistics courses is to, again, bring everybody onto the same playing field. A lot of times those intro classes have students that have never taken a linguistics class, they don't really know this stuff, but everyone has something meaningful to contribute in a linguistics class. Everyone's going to have an opinion, everyone is going to have different experiences with language that they bring to bear in the classroom. I especially like to, like I'm sure many use the New York dialect quiz to show people, look at this lexical variation that we all have. Because again, it puts us on the same playing field of there's no one right way of speaking. We all have these varied ways of speaking, just as we're all varied as human beings. And then in my language and discrimination class, I like to have students think about, I share, this type of work that I do, but then offer for them to think about the way language and power and then thus discrimination exists in their own life experiences. And so for courses, I usually have a final paper, a final project that relates to whatever is most useful to them. So if these are education students, how can you create some type of learning objectives for a classroom, or if you're a media student person, how can you create a podcast that gets at these types of things? And so I've been so excited. I've had art students, so many different folks that, again, I want them to take away, even if they don't do linguistics. Oh, linguistics, language discrimination, language ideology, it's relevant to everything that we do. So that's my big goal. And then I'm going to be teaching at Truman State University at the end of March as a visiting scholar, and I'll get to teach language and gender in minoritized communities, as well as varied perspectives on linguistic perception. And so those are, again, a little more tightly tied to my research programs, but I'm hoping to also, be able to generate these discussions with the students. Thanks for asking about my teaching.
So I wanted to piggyback on Nicole's question, because I love that Nicole, as I would expect, made this beautiful connection between research and pedagogy, which of course is part of our goal for putting together the series the way we did. I'm just wondering if you have some advice to share with anyone who is not a kind of card-carrying linguist, like an undergrad who's taking language and law or sociolinguistics, or any language class right now, or a teacher in K-12. If somebody's like inspired by what you talked about today, and they want to take what they learned from your talk and then carry it forward and have conversations, like what's a kind of accessible, easy way for them to do that, so that they're like, keeping the conversation going and helping to educate themselves and others?
It's a big question, but a good one. I mean, if the things that I said today or that you hear about linguistics in your classes in general interest you, you can email the people that are writing the papers that you're reading. Sometimes they won't answer, but sometimes they do. And I think that's a really exciting. Researchers love to talk about the work that they do. And often they're looking for research assistants and looking for people to do that work with them. So you can find a nice collaboration that you may not even have known that you could have done. And so that's one way. Obviously, I work on African American English, so two places to send folks immediately would be to the Googling Talking Black in America to Signing Black in America. These films are pretty short and are very accessible to the public, but also have with them learning materials that you can do on your own in those spaces. Also the Black language syllabus, that's from April Baker Bell. And she talks a lot about Black linguistic justice, but again, another very digestible space for you to think about how to relate this work, to generate further conversation. I'm also happy to answer emails and point you in directions of people I know if you tell me who you're interested in. I love working with students. Mentoring and teaching is probably my favorite thing about working in academia. So feel free to get in touch with me as well. Those are a couple of ways I'd say how we can keep the conversation going, for sure. Oh, follow Other Words on YouTube. I was featured on one talking about African American English, but in general, Other Words, which is hosted by Dr. Erica Brzozowski, has many different ways to think about language, whether it's literature and Shakespeare or bad words, things like this. So yeah, Other Words by PBS, a great way to think more about language in different frames.
It looks like in the chat, Deborah Boryholt has a question for Rachel.
Yes, Dr. Boryholt, hello. You're muted, Dr. Debbie, sorry.
Hello, Rachel. Every time I listen to your talks, there's just 1,000 more ways to think of this. So first of all, Jersey girl, here's a big Jersey hug from me to you. I am so thrilled that I'm actually seeing, so my compliments to my university for showcasing your work. I have to chase you all over the country from your dissertation to this. So congratulations. Here's what I'm impressed with. So as you know from your dissertation questions, and when you first told me you were going into linguistics, I was like, what? Why? But I am so impressed with the interdisciplinary work that's available here. I didn't even think about the criminal justice realm. As I work in survey design, so we, from a sociological standpoint, we understand interviewer effect and how that will, when people hear something, or, we've tested them on the phone, what kind of, do you think what is my gender or what is my race, and how that may affect how they answer questions about attitudes about immigration or egalitarian, equal pay. So your work is so widely applicable, and I think you would have a million collaborators. So I'm going to encourage you to think about inviting people like me and some of the other researchers and professors to build a meta analysis here, right? Because I think our job is to expose students to how wide this field is, how applicable it is, how we have heuristical biases and we don't even realize how our brain is processing things. So for every one of you, for one of us who say to you, hey, have you thought about doing this? Let's start thinking about a way to collaborate on our collective research and how important jury selection. I think about, from when I watched your, again, previous speeches, I think about how will Val Demings navigate a political realm, right, in terms of the way people see her or hear her. And so I just want to keep encouraging you. You've made me a bigger fan than usual, but just to challenge all of us to see how this work covers all of our disciplines. So again, well done, girlfriend. Very proud of you.
Thank you, Dr. Rory Holtz, one of my many people in my life that I cherish very much. I was actually on a panel earlier this week about what is language as faculty of mind. And one question that they had asked on that panel was about, when we think about research, obviously research funding is a big part of that. And so how do we get the money to do this kind of work when social outcome work doesn't necessarily have as much excitement as some other places that we'll see in the STEM world? And so your comments here, when we think about this meta-analysis and collaboration, makes me think about it's a very creative and good way for us to be able to get the work done and get the money to do the work that we want to do. So collaborating with governmental bodies, being able to talk with multiple universities across different fields, not only because it'd be great to get the funds to do the work, but because it's relevant to these different spaces. So we need to be talking to them more explicitly. So it's on my mind, and I will be in touch with you about it more intentionally.
That's right. I'm in line first, Rachel. We get to do our first collaboration together.
Thank you.
Okay, then. So we had a good, I think we had a good half hour of questions for Rachel. So everybody, thank you. Say again, thank you to Rachel for visiting us. Thank you so much for zooming in all the way from Oregon.
Absolutely. I hope to be able to come to New Jersey next time, for sure.
We would love to have you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.